The views and opinions expressed in this video are those of the speakers and panelists, and do not necessarily reflect the position of the ETHOS Institute for Public Christianity and its founding institutions and organizations.
Bioethics,
law, euthanasia,
consumerism,
politics, terrorism,
globalization,
religion,
migrant population,
interfaith, drug addiction.
Okay, so if we'll go ahead and dig into part one, and really we want to think, how should we think about science? And there are two basic aspects that we want to cover. The first is we want to distinguish between science and a different thing, but something that's often confused with it, that we call scientism. And then we want to think about how do we think about science in relation to theology. So these are the two main goals for our first session. Okay? So, science and scientism. Now, science is hard to define, actually. It's not as easy as you think. It's hard to come up with one definition of science that covers everything that we legitimately think of as science and excludes everything that we want to say is not science, like things like alchemy, let's say. And so we're not going to go down that rabbit hole. We're just going to adopt as a working definition that science is the study of the natural world. There are things we could add to that. We know that there are various empirical methods of observation and hypothesis formation and testing that are employed. But I think we'll just use this as a working definition. Okay? We need to make a distinction, though, between that and an ideology or a philosophy about science that someone has given the name scientism. Scientism. Now, scientism is a very different thing from science. Scientism is the ideology that says that science is the only paradigm of truth and rationality, at least in its strongest form. If something does not fit with currently well-established scientific beliefs, if it's not within the area of something that can be sort of scientifically tested or investigated, if it's not open to the scientific method, then it's not true or rational. Again, this is the strongest version. There are weaker versions as well. Everything outside of science is mere belief and opinion, of which rational assessment is impossible. Okay, so now that's kind of the statement of the strong view of scientism. There are actually two types, and I guess we could even think of these as being degreed. Okay, there are different levels of strength with which someone might hold the belief. So according to strong scientism, a proposition, theory, or belief is true and rational if and only if. And that's what that, yes, the double F is not a typo. That's shorthand for if and only if, okay? Because it's a definition. If and only if it is a scientific proposition or theory that has been formed, tested, and used according to appropriate scientific methods. And on this view, it's so extreme. There are no truths apart from scientific truths. Now we could pause for just a second. Do you see a problem with this way of thinking? Don't be shy. I'm going to try to get you guys to do some of the work. I've got a cold or something, so the less I talk and the more you talk, and in some ways the better. Is this belief itself something that's formed and tested according to a scientific method? I mean, was there an experiment conducted? Can we find an issue of a journal that relates to us how this was formed and how we can duplicate it? No, it's not. See, I mean, so this belief is so obviously false. It's hard to believe that people really take this way of thinking seriously. But you see, it's a contradiction. It contradicts itself because the statement itself is not a scientific statement by any standard. It's a philosophical statement about science. Okay, so what that means is this position is actually a contradiction. And a contradiction is something that is not possibly true in any world. There's no way this can be true. So most people, I think, wouldn't go to this extreme. But it's good to state it in its extreme form so we can really see it in all its clarity. Most people will sort of function from a more weaker position of scientism, which will say something like, well, yeah, there are some truths outside of science, and they might have some minimal positive epistemic status, rational status, but science is the highest. Science is the most authoritative. Science is the most valuable kinds of truth that we can have, the most authoritative field of human learning. Every other intellectual activity is inferior to science. And to the degree that some belief or theory outside of science can somehow gain scientific support, it gains. But science has nothing to gain from some idea from outside of science. So science can be the benefactor but never receives the benefit from other disciplines. Okay? And even on the view of weak scientism, there's no limit to science. We have an intellectual and moral obligation to try to apply science to solve problems in all fields of human endeavor and human life, okay? Including things like ethics and human behavior, all right? Now, I would suggest to you that if either form of scientism are true, it would have very drastic consequences for us as Christians. For we who are trying to integrate our theological and scientific beliefs. And I would suggest to you that neither of these alternatives are acceptable to us as Christians. If strong scientism is true and there's no truth at all outside of science, I would hate to inform you, but you're all wasting your time here, and you should have gone to Sentosa or somewhere else for your... There's no point to what we're doing. There's no point to what I'm doing at SBC or Roland at TTC either, because what we're doing has nothing to do with truth or knowledge. And we don't accept that. We absolutely do not accept that. By the way, let me just say greetings from Bible College, where I teach for the School of Theology English, my daytime job. And I'm very glad to be here and not grading Greek papers or other New Testament papers. I love talking about this stuff too. And let me also say, and I should preface this very importantly, what I say here is my own. These are my own views. And if you like them, well, come join us at SBC. You can learn more. If you don't like them, come join us at SBC. Some of my colleagues don't agree with me either. So this is my own view. Love it or hate it, I take responsibility for them. But what we do there, or at TTC, or what we're doing here, would be pointless if strong scientism is true. And I assume by the fact that you're all here, and none of you have gone for the door, you agree with me that strong scientism is something that we can dismiss. But what about weak scientism? Not so bad, but still unacceptable. Because on this view, theology is always sitting there where you guys are, and science is always standing up here where I am. Science is always lecturing to theology about what is acceptable. And it's not a dialogue, it's a very one-sided monologue or lecture, and we have to nod our heads, and just accept what they tell us is acceptable for us to believe as rational people. And I don't accept that either. In fact, I absolutely reject it. Okay, so what's wrong with scientism? I've already talked about how strong scientism is self-refuting, it is self-contradictory, it's necessarily false, not possibly true at all. Now, there's a second criticism, though, and that is that both forms of scientism fail to take into account that the task of stating and defending the presuppositions, the things that have to be true for science to be possible, are all philosophical issues. And to state these presuppositions, to defend these presuppositions, are all philosophical endeavors, not things that can be proven by a scientific methodology. And I have a list of about 10 of these here, which we're not going to go through. But books have been written about each of these things, okay? Things like the existence of a mind-independent world, the orderly and regular nature of that external world, the problem of induction, existence of truth, laws of logic, the adequacy of mathematics for describing that world, ethical values, report scientific results honestly. There's a whole host of philosophical issues that go into science. And stating and defending those things is not a scientific endeavor. Science receives them as a gift from another discipline, philosophy. So maybe we should say that if we want to pick a discipline that is sort of most authoritative, I'm not sure that that's a wise thing to do, but maybe philosophy is a better candidate than science, at least good philosophy. In every discipline there's good and bad and a mix of in between, right? So weak scientism fails to recognize this state of affairs. And then finally, the last criticism at the very bottom there of the screen is that both forms of scientism are contradicted by the existence of true and rationally justified beliefs outside of science, many which are more rationally justified than beliefs of science and will not be revised. For example, John F. Kennedy died November 22nd, 1963. 100 years from now, that fact will not be revised, or if it is, it will be revised to the detriment of everybody and their historical understanding. Everyone will have become less informed and have believed a falsehood, right? But how about our understanding of the electron or quarks? Do you think that'll be the same 100 years from now? Well, if you are familiar with the history of science, you will see, I'm not saying, by the way, that electrons or quarks don't exist, but our picture of them or our understanding of them has definitely changed through time. And the history of science tells us that probably, especially when we get to the very theoretical level, that these things will continue to be revised. And in fact, that's one of the virtues of science, right? But I don't think we're going to revise the historical fact that JFK died November 22nd, 1963, or C.S. Lewis as well died the very same day, right? Or that Lee Kuan Yew was the first prime minister of Singapore. 100 years from now, we're going to believe that. And if we don't, we've actually lost the truth, haven't we? Okay? We've lost historical knowledge if we revise those beliefs. Or that torturing babies for fun is wrong. That's an ethical belief that I'm more convinced of than almost any I think if I could say any scientific belief, right? And that's going to be revised. If it is revised, if 100 years from now people do not believe that torturing babies for fun is wrong, it will have been a loss of knowledge, right? It will not be a gain in knowledge. It will not be progress, right? So there are true and even better rationally justified beliefs outside of science. And even weak scientism fails at this point. Okay, so science is a wonderful and good human endeavor. And God has created us in such a way that it's possible we can discover truths about the natural world so that we can have practical problems solved. And that's basically the base of technology. While we have iPhones and all of the stuff that we're using here even today to do this seminar, that's a tremendous blessing. Science is also a discipline that solves for us theoretical or conceptual problems and gives us understanding of our world. And I count that as very valuable too. But let's not fall into this hubris and this ridiculous ideology of scientism where we make science the paradigm of knowledge and rationality. That's to take a good thing and I think to corrupt it. And so we want to not lapse into that. But in our culture, it's very prevalent to think this way, that science is the highest form of knowledge. And I would suggest to you we shouldn't put it in such a place. Okay, so that's science and scientism. Science is good, scientism is bad, and scientism is a bad cultural problem that we face. And it does impinge on our next major topic, which is how do we think about the relationship between science and theology? And you can see how that relationship would be very different if we accepted this view of scientism. But there are four basic views that we're going to be talking about, and perhaps I could illustrate them with a little help from the TV show CSI. Okay, it's getting a little old. I know I need to update this. So let's say, if you remember this show, there is, in the original CSI, there was a guy named Grissom, right? And pretty cool. I like him a lot better than Ted Danson. I don't know his character name, but Grissom is the original guy in the CSI set in Las Vegas. And then in CSI Miami, they have Horatio, who always says something and puts his shades on. And now that I'm getting older and very intolerant of contact lenses, I can't even do this with sunglasses like I used to. But let's imagine a scenario in which there's another character named Jim Brass, played by the actor Paul Guilfoyle. He's kind of like a police captain or something. And they're in the autopsy room, and he says, how did this guy die? And for some reason, I know one is in Miami, one is in Las Vegas, but let's say for some reason they're together, okay? And he's got these two CSI guys in the room, and he looks down at the dead body, and he says, okay, guys, how did this guy die, all right? So the first little orange, that represents conflict, okay? On the first view of conflict, Grissom would say something like this. He died from the bullet in his heart. And on the conflict view, Horatio would then do something like this. No. He died from strangling. Conflict. You see direct conflict there, right? A second view, represented by the fence in the second picture, is compartmentalization. And on this view, Grissom would say, he died from the bullet piercing his heart. And Horatio would say, no. He died because his number was up. It was just his time to go. Now, this is the opposite way of thinking about these issues, because in the first, they conflict directly. They're talking about the same thing and they're in direct disagreement, contradiction with one another. But this time, they're talking past each other. They're talking about two totally different kinds of things, okay? So that's compartmentalization. And then the third this one's kind of difficult to explain. We're going to spend some time elaborating on this, but for illustration's sake, it's called complementarity, and I've got it represented by this ladder, and I'll explain that. But on this view, Grissom would say something like this. He died because the bullet pierced his heart. And Grissom would say, no, he died because somebody killed him. Okay. Now, on this, what Horatio says in this instance is a little bit more relevant, but it's talking, it fits with, it can mesh with someone shooting him, but it's a different level of explanation. It's a personal type of explanation in terms of things like motive and intent and stuff like that, but not the physical, efficient causality of the mechanics of how he was killed. Okay, so there's still not quite an interaction there, even though both of these explanations can go together. And then finally, the last one is two little statues talking to each other. And this represents, I don't know a good word that starts with this, so I've just given it the name interaction, or you can think of dialogue or something like this. And on this view, the illustration would go something like this. Grissom would say something like, the bullet entered from the back. And Horatio would say, no, the bullet entered from the front. And there's a little bit back and forth between them, and Grissom would say, actually, the wound in the front is an exit wound. And then Horatio would say, really put the glasses on, proper glasses, right, and look closer. Oh, you're right. Okay, so on this, they're talking about the same thing. And they can agree with one another, possibly, or they can disagree, or agree, or support, or contradict. A lot of different ways are possible, but it's dialogue, and it's two-way, all right? And that's where I'm going to be going, and I'm going to suggest this is the appropriate model for understanding the relationship between science and faith. And so this will take us to the end of our first session. So let me elaborate a little bit on each of these, and for the first three, what I take to be the problems with them, okay? So first, the conflict view. This is a very popular view of science and theology. They're in conflict. They're fighting over the same turf. And we illustrated this with Grissom saying he died from the bullet in the heart, and Horatio said he died from strangling. That's how we illustrated that, okay? And this is a very popular view. It's held by many unsophisticated atheists. The village atheist of old who said, you know, science, human progress, atheism, they're all one and the same thing. And religion, that's the forces of darkness and ignorance and tradition and superstition holding us back from progress. But also there are many Christians who take a conflict view, I would argue as well. Christians in our churches who who are suspicious and hostile to science and think that there's something intrinsically contradictory to faith in science, and would warn people, don't do that, don't go that way, don't study that stuff. Your faith, to study science today, tomorrow you're not a believer, and that sort of thing. I've got a few suspects up here. So, of course, our friend Richard Dawkins, I think, is a good example of the conflict view of science and faith. For a Christian representative, I would suggest to you, I think Henry Morris, it's fair to, a founder of Institute for Creation Research and author of The Genesis Flood, is a good representative of this. And there are a couple of books that I've put up here that have been quite influential. John William Draper's book, The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, and Andrew Dixon White, founder of Cornell University, it's harder to see, but A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. Okay? Many people that have this understanding are fond of citing episodes from the history of science that supposedly illustrate their thesis, like the Catholic Church bullying Galileo. They'll talk about that. Or they'll talk about, in the United States, the Scopes trial of 1925 about a biology teacher who taught evolution against a law in the state of Tennessee that did not permit that. Very famous trial, more important for its cultural significance and for what actually happened in terms of, was this guy guilty or innocent, or was he punished, or whatever. In the UK, the example that they're fond of talking about is the debate between Samuel Wilberforce and Thomas Huxley. And in all of these, the history depicts these as somehow defining moments of this clash between science and religion, in which either science won culturally, or theology or the church did something that really disgraced itself historically. Okay? Now, this is actually a very flawed and disputed view. First of all, we've mentioned in passing, we haven't elaborated on it, but these 10 philosophical ideas that are necessary for science to get off the ground. And actually, being a Christian gives us good reason for believing those things are true. For example, the existence of a real mind-independent world, the reliability of our mind and sensory faculties for gaining information about that world, and things like that. The Christian worldview gives us good reason for believing that those things are true. And that's why thinkers like Stanley Yaki, it looks like Jackie, J-A-K-I, but apparently it's pronounced Yaki. Stanley Yaki has argued extensively that science was born in lands that were very much culturally dominated or conditioned by Christianity, especially Protestant Christianity, he clarifies, which is interesting because Yaki was a Catholic, and he would even go so far as to say that. Or more recently, Rodney Stark, a historian and sociologist, has argued in several works to this effect as well. The history shows us that monotheism in Christianity actually contributed to the birth and the growth of science in its early development. Now, that's really strange if they're inherently hostile. But the bottom line is Christianity gives us good reasons for certain basic philosophical presuppositions that make science possible. Now, if you think that your mind, or your brain, if you treat those as synonyms, which I don't, but if you think that came together by accident, I don't know how that gives you confidence that science works. But anyway, that's an issue for another day. Okay, secondly, the problem with conflict. This idea of the warfare between science and religion is a very recent invention. Now, I'm not a scientist, so some of you might wonder, what am I doing up here, by the way? And I need to make this point along the way, that this whole study of science and religion, faith, theology, and our worldview is very much an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary endeavor. So someday you should have a scientist come up here at ETHOS and discuss certain scientific evidences more directly. But also history plays a role. And actually, I am a history guy. That's my background. That's what I did my bachelor's level in. And it may not be good for making money, but it is good for addressing this issue a bit. And theology plays a role as well. Philosophy, all of these play a role. And I'm definitely more, there's a guy named C.P. Snow who did a famous lecture called The Two Cultures, and I'm definitely on the humanities side of that. But they do play a role in this, and that's mine. I don't want to misrepresent where I'm coming from, okay, or what my experience or authority is. But history, there's a debate about history, and there are these two books, that they're making a historical case here. And actually it's very flawed. This whole idea of the history of science and religion goes back to the late 1800s in Europe, when there was a cultural clash going on between atheists and agnostics, like Thomas Huxley, who resented the cultural dominance of Christianity and the church in Europe. And they were waging a cultural war or revolution to undo that, to supplant the church's cultural position. And they were using ideas like Darwin's theory of evolution as a weapon in that conflict. And so they basically made propaganda out of history and distorted it for these purposes. And so people like John William Draper or Andrew Dixon White, there were propagandists. And historians, there are historians who specialize only in this issue. Historians on the interface of science and religion or science and Christianity. And they come from a multitude of ideological perspectives, whether Christian, whether atheist, or what have you. These would be people like Edward Larson, Ronald Numbers, David Livingstone, various other names I could recommend to you. And they say this is bunk. This is not history. This is propaganda masquerading as history. And they refer to this as the Draper-White hypothesis, or the warfare thesis of history. And it's widely recognized among practicing historians of science that this is a falsehood. It was an ideological tool or weapon in a cultural war, one that's still going on, by the way. Now, let me give you a brief example to show the difference between the reality and the history by considering the Galileo affair. Now, the way these things are usually depicted, you've got one set of cowboys in white hats, in this case Galileo, one set of cowboys in black hats, the Catholic Church, and so forth. And it's very clear-cut what happens, One side is clearly the bad guy, one side is clearly the good guy. And you've got science versus religion. Everything is very clear-cut. But in reality, it's not so clear-cut. Consider the Galileo story for a moment and the characters involved. Everybody involved was Catholic. Everybody involved were religious and of the same religion, the Catholic religion. Everybody involved had a robust interest in science and the way the world worked and what new theories were showing about the world and how do we come to an integrated understanding of this. So it just does not break down into this neat black hats and white hats kind of a thing. What were some of the controversy? Well, what they argued about had more to do with the philosophy of science. Does it really show us the way the world is, or is it just a sort of a heuristic thing, like a learning tool, a way of thinking about or making sense of observations? How do we interpret the Bible? And Galileo wrote his own, papers on his views of how to interpret the Bible.